humanity had always been a bit of an anomaly in the galactic community. While most races were content with their niche, diplomatic, military, or otherwise, humans, with their odd mixture of adaptability, curiosity, and raw audacity, seemed to bumble their way through life, leaving a trail of confusion in their wake. It wasn't uncommon to find a human diplomat in the midst of a tense negotiation, completely unbothered by the fact that they were talking to a 7-foot-tall, six-eyed alien species that had once decimated entire planets in the name of honor. That was the situation Captain Eric Delaney found himself in now. He stood in the center of the Grand Conference Hall of the Xerex, an insectoid species known throughout the galaxy for their rigid hierarchy and strict codes of conduct. Their diplomatic process was as delicate as it was lethal. One wrong word, one misstep, and a war could erupt. Eric adjusted his uniform, checked his wristwatch, an old habit, and then glanced at his team. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Allison Ally Vickers, stood to his right, arms crossed, looking at the Xerex representatives with a mix of skepticism and impatience. Ally had been with Eric through every diplomatic crisis the United Earth Federation had thrown at them, from volatile trade deals to interspecies misunderstandings. Today, though, was different. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. The Xerex, having recently discovered a treasure trove of minerals in a system on the edge of human space, had suddenly decided that their territory extended into Earth's sphere of influence. They had made an ultimatum: either Earth would relinquish control of the system or face the consequences. "We'll handle it like we always do," Eric had said earlier, confident that his experience would be enough to de-escalate the situation. "A little charm, a little diplomacy. We can smooth this over." But now, standing here, the weight of the Xerex representative's stern silence was almost palpable. The room was filled with their imposing, chitinous forms, huge, muscular bodies that made even the most intimidating humans look small. The Xerex didn't speak often, but when they did, their voices rang with authority. "So," Eric said, breaking the silence. He was trying to sound confident, but even he could hear the slight quiver in his voice. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding. We've come to make sure that." "Misunderstanding," the lead Xerex representative, Zorith Tez, interrupted, his 6 yellow eyes narrowing in what could have been either disdain or curiosity. "You humans are masters of misunderstanding. Do you believe your little species can threaten our expansion?" Eric's lips twitched. He had been briefed extensively on the Xerex's pride and their territorial aggression, but hearing it directly still stung. "No, Zorith Tez," Eric said, stepping forward. "We don't want to threaten your expansion. We're simply looking for a peaceful solution that benefits both of our civilizations." He paused, a glimmer of an idea forming in his mind. "Perhaps we can discuss trade agreements. Exchange of technology?" Zorith Tez hissed, a sound that made Ally's skin crawl. "Trade? Humans have nothing of value to offer us." "Well, that's not entirely true," Ally chimed in, surprising everyone in the room. She leaned forward, her voice casual but with an undercurrent of something more sharp. "You may not think much of human technology, but we do have something that might interest you." Zorith Tez turned his many eyes on Ally, his mandibles clicking in a manner that was definitely not friendly. "Speak quickly, human." Ally's eyes met Eric's. A silent conversation passed between them, and Eric gave the slightest nod. Ally was playing a dangerous game, but that's what she did best. "Immunity," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "We've been negotiating with several galactic powers recently, and we've come to an agreement on, let's say, legal protections." Zorith Tez blinked slowly, an alien gesture that Eric could only interpret as confusion. "What is this immunity?" "It's a sort of privilege," Eric jumped in, choosing his words carefully. "When humans are involved in diplomacy, no matter where we go, we cannot be detained, imprisoned, or punished by local law during the course of negotiations. It's a tradition, something we've earned over centuries of peaceful relations across multiple galactic systems." The room went dead silent. Even the Xerex seemed to freeze for a moment, absorbing the weight of what Eric had just said. The concept of diplomatic immunity wasn't unique to humans. but the way Eric and Ally were presenting it, almost flippantly, was. Most species respected such agreements out of pragmatic necessity. In the grand scheme of galactic diplomacy, no one had dared challenge humanity's right to negotiate without fear of being bound by the laws of another species. But the Xerex were different. They didn't respect traditional norms. They were territorial and ruthless. If they found any weakness in this claim, they would exploit it. Zorath made a series of clicking sounds with his mandibles, which Eric quickly realized was laughter. Your species is ridiculous. You think we will allow you to waltz into our territory and wave this immunity, as though it means anything to us? Ally remained calm. She had dealt with worse. We're not here to waltz, she said, her voice low but steady. We're here to find common ground. To show you that we can help each other. Help each other? Zorath's voice was dripping with sarcasm. How do you intend to help us, human? Well, Eric said, stepping up again, his confidence returning, let's say we can help you understand the finer nuances of human diplomatic immunity. Perhaps you'd like to discuss the various advantages it can bring when dealing with other species? Enough, Zorath growled. I will not be swayed by your tricks. You have no place here. Eric felt a chill run down his spine. It was clear that this was no ordinary negotiation anymore. What had started as an offer of peaceful diplomacy was quickly spiraling into a high-stakes game of survival. We don't want to fight, Zorath, Eric said, his voice rising. But if you push us, we will defend ourselves. And you'll find that humans are surprisingly good at that. Zorath's many eyes narrowed into slits. He studied Eric for a long moment, as though deciding whether to attack or negotiate further. The tension in the room was unbearable. If they didn't come to an agreement soon, the Xerex might decide that humanity's immunity wasn't worth the trouble. Fine, Zorath said, finally breaking the silence. You have one cycle to prove your immunity. But be warned, human. Fail, and I will have you removed from this system, permanently. Eric and Ally exchanged a look. The stakes had just been raised. They had one cycle, a mere 48 hours, to convince the Xerex that humanity's diplomatic immunity wasn't just a legal formality, it was a critical piece of galactic diplomacy that could make or break their ability to engage in future peace talks. The challenge was enormous, but Eric wasn't about to back down. He turned to his team, his expression hardening. Let's get to work. The two humans sat in the cramped conference room aboard the Xerex capital ship, staring across the table at the alien delegates. The clock on the wall ticked away in steady rhythm, a constant reminder of the pressure bearing down on them. Eric Delaney sat with his hands clasped, leaning slightly forward, eyes scanning the Xerex representatives across from him. Ally Vickers was at his side, her fingers drumming lightly against the tabletop, a gesture that betrayed her otherwise calm demeanor. The problem was simple, but the solution was anything but. They had been given 48 hours to prove that humanity's diplomatic immunity was legitimate, or they would be forcibly ejected from the Xerex system. The only complication was that the Xerex didn't believe for a second that immunity meant anything more than a few legal loopholes and the hollow posturing of weaker species. In their eyes, the concept of diplomacy itself was a sign of weakness. They had a long history of conquering other civilizations, and what Eric and Ally were asking of them was as foreign as the idea of peace itself. So, Eric muttered, breaking the silence. How exactly are we supposed to convince them that we're not bluffing? Ally, whose attention had shifted to the data pad in front of her, didn't immediately respond. She was deep in thought, her fingers swiftly flicking through pages of information. Finally, she sighed, her eyes lifting to meet Eric's. To start with, we need something Xerex actually care about, Ally said, her voice quiet but firm. If we're going to prove that we have leverage, we need to show them that this isn't just some insignificant claim. We have to make them see that human immunity could be an asset to them, not just a diplomatic nicety. Eric rubbed his temples, a headache slowly beginning to form. Problem is, they don't care about niceties. And they sure as hell don't care about anything that doesn't serve their expansionist goals. Exactly, Ally agreed, her eyes alight with sudden inspiration. Which is why we need to approach this from an entirely different angle. We can't convince them through diplomacy alone. We need to show them that their system could be vulnerable without us. Eric raised an eyebrow. What do you mean by vulnerable? Ally smirked. We're talking about the Xerex, a species that prides itself on dominance and control, right? What if we could show them that they need human diplomacy not just for peace, but for their survival in this galaxy? We'll find a way to make them realize that challenging humanity's immunity could cost them more than it's worth. Eric leaned back in his chair, pondering Ally's words. It was a bold idea, but risky. If they were wrong, they could inadvertently escalate the situation to the point where the Xerex might not just expel them, but wipe them out altogether. But Ally had a point, the Xerex were not motivated by ideals like justice or fairness. They were a species that thrived on strength and opportunity. So, what if they could twist the narrative to make the Xerex see human immunity as a potential advantage rather than a threat? We need leverage, Eric muttered. We need to find a way to make them believe that we can offer them something they can't get anywhere else. Just then, a commotion outside the door disrupted their thoughts. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, followed by the unmistakable hum of Xerex guards' exoskeletons. The door slid open with a hiss, and Zorith Tez, the towering lead delegate, entered, flanked by two of his warriors. His insectoid eyes fixed on Eric and Ally, his gaze piercing. You humans are wasting my time, Zorith Tez growled, his mandibles clicking in agitation. The cycle is almost over. Do you have anything of worth to present? Eric stood slowly, trying to mask the growing tension in his chest. We're working on it, Zorith Tez. But we're not going to pull something out of thin air. This is going to take time. Zorith Tez's 6 yellow eyes glowed faintly as he scrutinized Eric. You seem to think time is on your side. It is not. My patience is limited. I suggest you come up with something soon or face the consequences. Ally stood, her expression resolute. We have something that might interest you, Zorith Tez. It's not just about legal immunity. It's about opportunity. The Xerex delegate tilted his head, the mandibles on either side of his face clicking together in slow, deliberate movements. Opportunity, he repeated, clearly intrigued but not convinced. Explain. We've been in contact with several galactic powers recently, Ally continued, keeping her voice steady, even as Eric's heart rate spiked. Humanity has negotiated peace agreements across various sectors, from the Andromeda cluster to the outer rims of the Vexian belt. Our unique position in the galaxy has allowed us to broker deals between species that otherwise would never have been able to coexist. Zorith Tez's eyes narrowed. And what does this have to do with our immunity? It means, Eric interjected, that humanity has established itself as an essential neutral force. We've mediated peace, secured resources, and provided stability where others have failed. We have connections, diplomatic leverage, that few others can claim. Ally stepped forward, her tone taking on a sharper edge. Think about it, Zorith Tez. Your people are expansionists. You conquer, you consume, you grow, but there are limits to that. Eventually, you'll encounter another species you can't just steamroll. Wouldn't it be better to have someone like us around, someone who can help you navigate the intricacies of the galaxy without resorting to violence? The silence in the room was deafening. Zorith Tez's mandibles clicked again, but this time it was a thoughtful gesture rather than a dismissive one. The Xerex were a species that viewed conflict as the natural order, but even they understood the value of alliances. The question was whether they would see this as an opportunity or a weakness. You make a compelling case, Zorith Tez admitted slowly, his tone measured. But I am still not convinced that your immunity is worth the trouble. What would your people ask of us in exchange for this opportunity you speak of? Ally exchanged a look with Eric. They hadn't prepared for this line of questioning. The Xerex weren't asking for what they could offer, they were asking for what it would cost. Eric took a deep breath. They were in too deep now. There was no turning back. What we ask for is simple, Eric said, standing tall. We ask for access to your resources, specifically, your military-grade alloys. You have a mineral resource unlike anything else in the galaxy, and we believe that the best way to ensure peace between our species is to collaborate in that area. We will help you develop your technology in exchange for guaranteed access to those minerals. Zorath Tez was silent for a moment, considering the offer. The Xerex prized their strength, and it was clear that the idea of human assistance in their technological development was appealing. But there was still the question of whether it would be worth the risk of granting humanity immunity in their system. You ask much, Zorath Tez finally said, his voice heavy with suspicion. But perhaps this is not entirely without merit. We will consider your request. But know this, humans, if we do not find this proposal worthy of our time, you will leave our system with nothing. Ally and Eric exchanged a tense glance. They had made their case, but the Xerex were not convinced. It was far from a victory, but it wasn't a loss either. They had only bought themselves a little more time. The clock was still ticking, and the real challenge was just beginning. Thank you for your consideration, Eric said, trying to keep his voice steady. We look forward to your decision. As Zorath Tez and his guards left the room, Eric and Ally were left alone with the weight of the situation hanging over them. They had made an offer, but would the Xerex see it as an opportunity, or would they simply reject it out of hand? We're not out of the woods yet, Ally muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric nodded. No. But we're one step closer. And that's all we need. As the door slid shut behind the Xerex delegation, the humans sat in silence, the pressure mounting. Time was running out, and they had no idea what the next 24 hours would bring. But one thing was certain, if they were going to survive this, they would need more than just words. They would need something that could turn the tide, and fast. The heavy air of tension pressed down upon the human diplomats as the hours dwindled to mere minutes. Captain Eric Delaney stood in the makeshift war room aboard the Xerex capital ship, his fingers wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of coffee, something he hadn't had the luxury of savoring for the last 2 days. The room was dimly lit, a sharp contrast to the brightly sterile corridors of the ship. Its walls were lined with tactical displays, an assortment of information flashing across the screens, all reminders of the ticking clock. Eric glanced at Lieutenant Ally Vickers, who was hunched over a console at the far end of the room. Her normally sharp posture was slouched with exhaustion, but her fingers flew across the control pad in a blur, her mind still racing despite the long hours they had spent trying to piece together a solution. Her brow furrowed as she shifted between various data streams, her mind working to assess every angle. Anything? Eric asked, his voice gravelly from too many hours spent talking, debating, and negotiating. Ally didn't look up from the screen. I've got nothing solid yet. But we're running out of options, Eric. They've made it clear that they're not going to give us much longer. If we don't have something to show them within the next few hours, we'll be out on our ears, at best. The weight of her words settled in the room, and for a moment, Eric felt the crushing sense of helplessness that had followed him since the Xerex had first presented their ultimatum. The situation had escalated from a simple negotiation over territory into a high-stakes diplomatic standoff. The Xerex were not like the other species humanity had dealt with in the past, cooperative, willing to listen to reason. No, the Xerex were proud, territorial, and merciless in their pursuit of domination. Eric had seen firsthand how easily they crushed anything that even remotely threatened their power. Their honor demanded nothing less. Ally had proposed leveraging humanity's diplomatic immunity as their trump card, but now, as time dwindled, it was clear that immunity alone wasn't enough. They had tried to convince the Xerex that their neutrality was worth something, that humanity's unique role as peacekeepers could be their ticket to survival. But the Xerex weren't buying it. They saw weakness, not opportunity. They needed something more, a way to make the Xerex realize that their refusal to accept humanity's immunity would hurt them more than it would hurt Earth. Eric, Ally finally said, her voice cutting through the silence, there's something we haven't considered. Eric's attention snapped back to her. What's that? Ally looked up, her eyes narrowing in concentration. We've been trying to sell them on diplomacy, right? But we've ignored one key element: what happens if diplomacy fails? What if we can show them that pushing us into a corner will only make things worse for them in the long run? We need to make them understand that they're not the only ones who know how to fight dirty. Eric's pulse quickened as the implications of Ally's words began to sink in. You're suggesting we show them what happens if they don't back down? Exactly, Ally said, her voice rising with excitement. We're not going to start a war. That's not the goal. But we can show them how costly it will be to keep pushing humanity. They've underestimated us. And now we need to show them that underestimating humanity isn't just dangerous, it's costly. Eric leaned forward, eyes wide as the pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. It was a dangerous gambit, but at this point, what choice did they have? We don't have the military presence here to take on the Xerex, Eric said slowly, processing the idea. But we do have something they don't. Our ability to make things uncomfortable for them without ever firing a shot. Ally nodded, her fingers already moving over the console again. We've got access to a variety of systems and tools they don't know about. Nothing that will start a war, but enough to make them regret underestimating us. The plan was simple, albeit high risk. The Xerex had boasted about their military superiority, their fleet of advanced warships, their sheer size and strength. But what they hadn't considered was the way humanity could manipulate their systems. It wasn't about brute force, it was about exploiting the Xerex's own weaknesses. Ally had spent hours combing through the ship's databases and communication systems, identifying key vulnerabilities. There were a few small miscalculations on the part of the Xerex, things that humans had exploited in other diplomatic missions before. Small things, like communication relays and tracking systems, could be sabotaged from the inside, causing confusion and chaos without leaving a trace. There was no need for warships, no need for soldiers. Just a few well-placed, well-timed moves. We'll disable their communications, Ally continued, eyes flickering with excitement. Just for a few minutes. Enough to make them think their systems are compromised. It'll send a signal that humanity is not to be trifled with. Eric didn't hesitate. Do it. The next few hours were a blur. Ally worked tirelessly, coordinating with human engineers back on Earth, utilizing every available channel to gain access to the Xerex's communications and tactical systems. Eric, for his part, tried to keep his mind focused on the bigger picture, convincing the Xerex that humanity wasn't just a passing annoyance, but a force to be reckoned with. Finally, as the Xerex delegates gathered in the central meeting hall to review the humans' final offer, Ally sent the signal. The room went dark, the lights flickering as the sudden disruption spread across the Xerex ship. The communications relays went down, followed by the tactical systems. The Xerex were caught off guard, scrambling to assess the issue. Their typical sense of control was slipping. For the first time, they were unsure. It was exactly what Eric had hoped for. He had arranged for their final meeting to occur while the Xerex were still reeling from the disruption. As Zorith stormed into the room, his multiple eyes blazing with fury, Eric and Ally remained calm, not a flicker of nervousness in their expressions. The Xerex leader immediately noticed the change in the atmosphere. His guards flanked him, their insectoid forms rigid, their mandibles clicking in agitation. What is the meaning of this? Zorith hissed, his voice sharp and dangerous. Ally stepped forward, her face a mask of professionalism. There's been a minor malfunction with your systems. We apologize for the inconvenience. Eric stood, meeting Zorith's gaze with unwavering confidence. It seems, Zorith, that when you push humanity into a corner, things start to unravel. Systems get compromised. Things stop working. If we wanted to, we could have made your entire fleet go dark for hours. But that's not the message we're sending. We're simply showing you what happens when you underestimate us. Zorith's mandibles clicked with a sound that could only be described as a nervous twitch. His eyes darted around the room, as if trying to find a way to regain control. For a long moment, there was no sound, just the heavy, tense silence hanging in the air. Then, slowly, Zorith took a step back, his posture softening just slightly. "You humans play dangerous games," he said, his voice low and calculating. "Perhaps," Eric replied, a smile tugging at his lips. "But we've always had a talent for making the impossible possible. It's not about war, Zorith. It's about ensuring that everyone plays by the same rules." Ally gave Eric a small nod, knowing the Xerex were still processing their options. The gambit had worked, at least for now. But the real test was yet to come. If the Xerex saw the human threat as real, they would finally begin to consider the true value of humanity's immunity. "Consider your position carefully, Zorith," Eric said, his voice calm but firm. "We're not your enemies. We're the ones who can keep your ambitions from collapsing under their own weight. But only if you're willing to accept that our immunity is not a weakness, it's your key to long-term stability." Zorith remained silent, his expression unreadable. But in his eyes, Eric could see the seeds of doubt starting to take root. The Xerex were no longer certain. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, Eric felt a flicker of hope. This was the turning point. The waiting was the worst part. The seconds felt like hours, and every tick of the clock on the wall seemed to echo in Eric's mind. He stared out the small, circular window of the human diplomatic quarters aboard the Xerex capital ship, his eyes tracing the distant stars beyond. In the vastness of the galaxy, the tiny human delegation seemed like an insignificant speck, vulnerable and fragile. Yet, here they were, standing at the precipice of a diplomatic breakthrough, or a catastrophic failure. The disruption they had caused to the Xerex systems was a calculated risk. It had rattled their confidence, made them question their invulnerability, but now it was a waiting game. The Xerex were nothing if not patient, and their silence spoke volumes. After the chaotic meeting where Eric and Ally had pushed their audacious message, the Xerex had retreated into their chambers, promising to consider their position carefully. That had been hours ago. And now they were supposed to make their final decision. Eric could feel the weight of it all, the uncertainty pressing on his shoulders. There was no guarantee the Xerex would come around. They had a history of crushing anyone who dared challenge their authority, and humanity's unique diplomatic immunity didn't hold the same weight for them that it might with more cooperative species. The Xerex believed in strength, dominance. Diplomacy wasn't in a lexicon unless it served their purposes. Beside him, Ally was pacing, the rhythmic sound of her boots against the floor a constant companion to his thoughts. She was in her element, calculating, strategizing, analyzing. But even she couldn't predict how this would play out. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the door to their quarters slid open. Zorith, the towering Xerex delegate, entered the room, flanked by his guards. His 6 golden eyes glinted in the dim light, his insectoid form exuding both power and menace. The moment he stepped inside, the room seemed to tighten, the air thickening with the anticipation of what was to come. "I trust you have had time to reflect," Eric said, his voice steady despite the rapid thumping of his heart. He had to remain calm. He had to project confidence, or this would all fall apart. Zorith didn't speak at once. Instead, he studied the humans in silence, his eyes flicking between Eric and Ally. The tension was unbearable, but it was clear from his slow, deliberate movements that he was savoring the moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, resonant growl that reverberated in Eric's chest. "You humans are more than I expected," Zorith said, his mandibles clicking in what could almost be called a thoughtful manner. "You are persistent, resourceful, and dangerous." Ally stood taller at his words, but Eric remained impassive. "We didn't want to come to this point, Zorith. But you gave us little choice." The Xerex delegate tilted his head, clearly intrigued. "You think that making us question our power will make us accept your terms?" he asked, his voice cold, though there was a hint of something else, respect? Curiosity? Eric allowed himself a small, calculated smile. "Not at all. We don't need to make you accept anything. We just wanted to show you that your position is not as unassailable as you think." Zorith didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved toward the center of the room, his massive form filling the space. There was a palpable weight to the silence, as if every word they spoke could tip the scales in one direction or another. Ally stepped forward, her stance firm, her gaze never leaving the Xerex leader. "What you have to understand," Ally said, her voice quiet but clear, "is that humanity has always found a way to survive. We've fought against impossible odds, outsmarted enemies who thought they could crush us, and we've come out stronger every time. It's not just about fighting, it's about adaptability, intelligence. We don't need to overpower you, we just need to show you that we're not something you can push around." Zorath's eyes narrowed as he studied Ally, as if trying to determine whether she was bluffing or speaking the truth. Then, with a quick movement, he waved a clawed hand toward the door. One of his guards stepped forward and handed him a small data pad, which Zorath studied intently. There was no doubt that the delegate was weighing their words carefully. A moment passed, then two, before he finally looked up, meeting their eyes. "Your actions have been unorthodox," Zorath said slowly. "But they have made an impression." Ally's heartbeat quickened, but she didn't allow her excitement to show. "We don't want a war, Zorath. We want peace. We want cooperation, not conflict. But if you push us, if you continue to test our patience, there will be consequences. Humanity doesn't operate under your rules, and that's not something you can change." The Xerex delegate remained silent for another long moment. Eric's mind raced, trying to anticipate the Xerex's next move. They had done everything they could to make their point clear. They had shown strength without violence, intelligence without force. Now, it was up to the Xerex to decide whether they were willing to swallow their pride, or whether they would continue their dangerous path toward conflict. Finally, Zorath spoke, his tone measured and cold. "Your immunity, it has merit. I see now that your place in this galaxy is not something to be ignored." A surge of hope flickered through Eric, but he kept his face neutral. "We told you, Zorath. Humanity is not a threat unless provoked. We have the means to defend ourselves, but we prefer peace. We always have." Zorath's gaze shifted between Eric and Ally, and for the first time since their arrival, there was something like respect in his eyes. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He turned slightly, his guards stepping back, and the Xerex delegate took a deep breath, the weight of centuries of pride and conquest hanging over him. "I will take this to the council," he said finally, his voice heavy with the implication that whatever decision was made next would affect the future of both their species. "But I believe you are correct. Your immunity is not a mere formality. There is value in your position, more than I initially understood." Eric nodded, a sense of cautious optimism settling in his chest. "We're glad you understand. Humanity wants nothing more than to see peace and stability spread across the galaxy. We can help you achieve that. Together." Zorath didn't respond immediately. He simply gave a small nod, acknowledging the weight of the human's words. The room was still tense, but the dynamic had shifted. There was no longer an open threat looming over them. The Xerex were considering their words, processing the situation in a way they hadn't before. "As I said," Zorath finally added, his voice calm but not without a hint of finality, "I will take this to the council. But you have made a lasting impression on me, humans. I have never encountered a species quite like yours." With that, Zorath and his guards turned and left the room, the door sliding shut behind them. Silence settled in the room once again. But this time, the silence was different. This time, it was a silence filled with possibility. Eric and Ally stood together, exchanging a look of disbelief. For the first time in days, they allowed themselves to exhale, the tension that had gripped them slowly easing away. "We did it," Ally whispered, her voice barely audible. Eric didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped toward the window, staring out at the stars once more. There was a long road ahead, but they had won a battle, a significant one. Humanity had proven that it wasn't just a weak, fledgling species, it was a force to be reckoned with. "Not yet," Eric finally said, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. "But we're getting there." As they stood there, looking out into the vast unknown, one thing was certain: humanity's place in the galaxy had just been secured. The future was uncertain, but they had shown that they were no longer just another footnote in the history of the stars. Humanity had earned its seat at the table, and nothing, not even the Xerex, would ever take it away.